Jiro was the kind of kid who never really fit in anywhere. At school, most of his classmates treated him like some strange weirdo, and because of that, he had no real friends to talk to. One day, he was sitting there complaining about how everyone saw him, while someone beside him tried to cheer him up and told him that being different was not always a bad thing. The funny part is that the one giving him that advice was actually his dog, which honestly makes it a little easier to understand why everyone thought Jiro was strange. The truth is, Jiro had been born with a rare ability that allowed him to hear the voices of animals. To him, speaking with them felt completely normal, but to everyone else, watching him casually talk to cats, dogs, and birds was more than enough to make them keep their distance. So as Jiro grew older, the only companions he truly had were the animals around his neighborhood. And because they were the only ones who accepted him, he was willing to go pretty far to protect them, even if that meant picking fights with delinquents who tried to hurt them. After Jiro chased those delinquents away, the cat and crow he protected thanked him for stepping in, explaining that those guys had been bothering them a lot recently. Jiro acted like it was nothing and started heading home. But the moment he returned, his grandfather immediately started yelling at him after realizing he had gotten into another fight. He reminded Jiro that he did not teach him shinobi techniques just so he could run around the neighborhood beating people up. Then he accused Jiro of embarrassing their family name, but Jiro coldly said he did not care about that stupid name at all. That comment pushed his grandfather over the edge, and in a fit of rage, the old man grabbed the family's treasured cat Anna and started chasing Jiro around the house. Soon after, things finally calmed down. Jiro and his grandfather ended up fixing the broken doors, but then his grandfather remembered that he had a community meeting to attend. And since he would be coming home late, he told Jiro to lock everything up before going to sleep. Jiro quietly complained under his breath, but he still agreed. However, shortly after his grandfather left, the same crow from earlier suddenly appeared and called out to Jiro, asking for help. Apparently, there was a cat badly hurt somewhere in the woods. Jiro had no idea what was really going on, but he followed the crow anyway. When they reached the spot, he found a cat lying beneath a tree with severe injuries. Neither Jiro nor the crow had ever seen that cat in the area before, and they could not figure out what had happened to it. But since the cat was still breathing, Jiro decided he was going to do whatever he could to save it. What Jiro did not know was that this injured cat was not an ordinary animal at all. Before ending up in that condition, he was known as Rago, the Devourer of the Sun. He had been summoned by a mysterious group that wanted to control his power for their own purposes. But when Rago refused to obey them, the very people who summoned him tried to kill him instead. When Rago finally opened his eyes again, he found himself lying in a soft, warm cat bed inside Jiro's house. A moment later, Jiro came into the room to check on him. He was relieved to see that the cat had finally woken up, because with injuries that severe, Jiro honestly had not been sure whether it would survive. Since he figured the cat was probably thirsty, he placed a bowl of water nearby. Then he introduced himself and casually asked the cat to do the same. Rago immediately thought Jiro had to be a complete idiot. Even if he gave his name, there was no way an ordinary human could understand a cat's words. But Jiro instantly responded, telling him it was rude to call someone an idiot for no reason. The moment Rago realized that Jiro could actually understand him, he panicked and shot under the bed, refusing to come out. To him, the human understanding animal speech made absolutely no sense. Jiro understood why Rago was startled, especially if he had never spoken to a human before, so he calmly told him that he was safe here and that nobody was going to hurt him. But Rago did not trust the situation that easily. He could not sense any spiritual energy coming from Jiro, which meant Jiro really did seem to be human. Still, Rago decided it was safer to stay hidden until he found a chance to escape. That plan lasted only a few seconds because Jiro soon returned with food. The second Rago smelled it, all of his caution disappeared. He was starving, his pride clearly was not stronger than his hunger. Jiro found it funny how quickly Rago gave in, but Rago did not look embarrassed at all. He simply said that no hungry man would ever turn down a meal. Jiro laughed at the idea of a cat calling itself a man, but Rago immediately snapped back and insisted that he was not a cat. He then properly introduced himself as an immortal being, or as they were more commonly known in this world, a mononoke. Rago explained that mononoke often take the form of humans or animals and live among normal people without being discovered. Jiro did not fully understand everything he was saying, but one question immediately came to mind. If mononoke were supposed to be such powerful beings, then how did Rago end up beaten and injured like this? Rago answered that another mononoke had been responsible. When Jiro asked why they attacked him, Rago admitted that his memories were still unclear. He could not remember every detail, but he knew that another mononoke had come to him wanting his help with something. And when Rago refused, they turned on him. Jiro started piecing the situation together. From what Rago was saying, it sounded like those guys asked for his cooperation, and the moment he rejected them, they jumped him. Still, Jiro did not understand why Rago refused in the first place. Since they were Mononoke too, he assumed Rago would want to help someone from his own kind, but Rago made it clear that he hated people like that. To him, they were nothing but parasites, the type who acted strong while depending entirely on someone else's power. Rago then said there was probably no point explaining any of this to Jiro anyway, since a normal human would never believe a story about immortals and monsters. But Jiro reminded him that he was talking to someone who had been able to speak with animals his entire life. Compared to that, the idea of immortal monsters living in secret was not really the craziest thing he had ever heard. At the same time, deep in the forest, a female agent arrived at the place where Jiro had originally discovered Rago. After examining the area, she contacted headquarters and reported that she'd found a pool of blood. The blood had already been confirmed as Rago's, but there was one strange detail. She could not sense his spiritual presence anywhere nearby, and because of that, she believed he must have survived and gone into hiding somewhere in the area. Her superior ordered her to wait until the rest of the search team arrived before doing anything else, so she agreed to fall back for now and disappeared into the thin air. But she was not the only one searching the forest for signs of Rago. Back at Jiro's house, things were far calmer. Jiro was giving Rago a bath, partly to clean him up and partly to help himself relax. He was honestly surprised by how fast Rago's wounds had healed, because the injured cat from earlier already looked almost completely fine. As he washed him, Jiro started remembering his old dog Naki. She had been huge, fluffy, and always knew exactly how to comfort him. Whenever Jiro came home after being bullied or hurt, Naki would ask him to give her a bath, because she somehow knew that doing something simple like that helped him calm down. At night, Jiro went to sleep. At least that was what Rago believed. The moment he thought Jiro was fully asleep, he climbed onto the windowsill and prepared to leave. Rago did not want to disappear without saying anything, especially after Jiro had saved his life. But he understood that staying in that house would only drive Jiro into danger, so he jumped out the window. And when he landed, his body wavered slightly. His injuries may have closed, but his strength still had not fully returned. Even so, he tried to leave the property. Before he could get far, Jiro suddenly appeared behind him and asked where he thought he was going in the middle of the night. Rago froze in shock because he was certain he had just seen Jiro sleeping upstairs. But Jiro had already guessed that Rago might try to sneak away, so he had placed a dummy illusion in his bed to fool him. Rago was annoyed by the cheap trick, but he still told Jiro to stop involving himself in his problems. As far as Rago was concerned, Jiro had already done more than enough. But Jiro refused to let him walk away like that. He reminded Rago that he was the one who saved him, and that meant Rago was his responsibility until he recovered properly. Rago snapped back that he never asked to be saved in the first place. In fact, if Jiro had not interfered, Rago would have been perfectly fine with dying out there. Jiro kept trying to argue with him, but Rago finally ran out of patience. He reminded Jiro that no matter how harmless he looked right now, he was still a mononoke, a monster known for eating humans. Because of that, the smartest thing Jiro could do was return to bed, forget this ever happened, and pretend they had never met. But before Jiro could respond, a strange man suddenly stepped into the house and interrupted them. Jiro had no idea who this stranger was, so he immediately told him to leave since nobody had invited him there. But the man looked down on him and called him an ignorant human. Then his arm began to twist and transform into something monstrous before he launched himself straight at Jiro. The attack came so suddenly that Jiro did not have enough time to react. But Rago refused to watch him get killed. Even in his weakened state, he leaped forward, shoved Jiro out of the way, and lured the attacker into the forest. Rago tried to escape through the trees, but his body still had not recovered its original strength. Because of that, the demon caught up to him almost immediately and slammed him into the ground. Standing over him, the demon told Rago that he still had a chance to change his mind and cooperate. After all, their side had gone through a lot of trouble to break the seal that had kept Rago imprisoned, and killing him after all that effort would be a waste. But Rago only mocked him. If they wanted his power that badly, then they would have to risk their lives and take it by force. The demon charged at him again, ready to crush him completely. But before the attack could land, Jiro suddenly appeared with his family katana and sliced across the demon's arm. Rago was stunned that Jiro had actually returned. He called him an idiot for throwing away the chance he had given him to run, but Jiro refused to leave him behind. He said he could not just abandon Rago in the forest and let that monster kill him. And even if he had run away, the demon probably would have come after him next anyway, so fighting back was the only choice that made sense. The demon then revealed its full monstrous form and prepared to tear Jiro apart. However, it was surprised to see that Jiro did not flinch at all, even after seeing its true appearance. Then it noticed the markings on Jiro's katana and remembered the stealth technique he had just used. From that, the demon realized that Jiro was likely connected to the shinobi. Without wasting any more time, the demon rushed in and threw a heavy punch. For a second, it seemed like the attack had landed, but when the demon looked at its fist, it found only a piece of cloth. Jiro had already slipped away and was coming down from above for a counterattack. The move was clever, but Jiro had badly misjudged the monster's speed. Before he could strike, the demon vanished behind him in an instant and drove its finger straight through Jiro's back. Even after taking such a serious wound, Jiro still tried to swing his katana for one final attack. But the demon leaped back and avoided it easily. It was impressive that Jiro could even think about attacking while injured that badly, but in the end, it made no difference. A wound like that was far too severe for any normal human to survive. Rago slowly approached Jiro and stared down at his dying body, overwhelmed with guilt. He knew that none of this would have happened if Jiro had never gotten involved with him. But when the demon noticed the way Rago was looking at Jiro, he misunderstood the situation completely. He assumed Rago was thinking about eating him, since consuming a human would help him recover his original strength. Because of that, the demon offered to let Rago have Jiro's body, hoping that regaining his power would convince him to finally cooperate with their side. But Rago had no intention of doing something like that. It was true that eating Jiro would restore his strength, but Jiro had saved his life, protected him, and even risked everything for him. Rago owed him far too much to let him die here. So instead of devouring Jiro, Rago chose the opposite. He decided to let Jiro take in his power. Rago transformed into his true form and flew straight into Jiro's body, releasing a massive surge of dark energy. As Rago's power began flooding out, the demon was left in disbelief. He could not believe that Rago would go so far as to turn against his own kind and hand his strength over to a human. A moment later, Jiro regained consciousness as Rago's power healed the wound in his back. He had no idea what had just happened, and the black smoke pouring from his body only made him even more confused. Then Rago's voice echoed inside his head, telling him to stop panicking and focus, because the fight was not over yet. The demon attacked again, but this time Jiro's body moved completely differently. With Rago's power inside him, he was fast enough to avoid the demon's strikes and dodge before he could be stabbed again. Still, Jiro had no clue how he was supposed to defeat a monster like this. That was when Rago told him not to overthink it. All Jiro needed to do was make a fist and Rago would take care of the rest. Jiro did not fully understand what that meant, but he trusted him and threw a punch anyway. The moment his fist moved forward, Rago released his energy through the attack, blasting straight through the demon's torso and killing him with a single strike. Jiro could only stand there in shock, struggling to process everything that had just happened. But before he had any time to calm down, agents from the Espionage Bureau suddenly surrounded him. They had arrived after detecting the powerful spiritual disturbance in the area, and without giving Jiro a chance to explain, they knocked him unconscious and took him back to find out what really happened. When Jiro finally comes to, he is lying in a hospital bed with the same girl who knocked him unconscious standing beside him. The moment she notices that he has opened his eyes, she immediately calls her superior to report that Jiro is finally awake. Jiro still has no clue who she is or why he has been brought here, so he demands an explanation. But before she can answer, Rago suddenly emerges from his body and admits that he is just as confused as Jiro. A moment later, Ichika notices Rago casually sitting on top of Jiro's head. Jiro finally feels him there and starts shouting for Rago to get off. Not long after that, Ichika's superior arrives to examine the situation himself. He says he is relieved to see that Jiro appears unharmed, then asks Rago how he is feeling. Rago, however, has absolutely no interest in speaking with him. Despite the obvious hostility, the man is surprised by how restrained Rago seems, since he expected the Mononoke to react far more aggressively. The man then introduces himself as Ryusuke Shiba, the head of the Mononoke division, while Ichika is one of the agents working under him. Since Jiro wants to understand what is happening, Shiba begins by asking whether he has ever heard of the Oniwa Band. Jiro remembers learning that they were covert operatives who once served the Edo Shogunate. Shiba explains that after the shogunate disappeared, the organization continued operating under the modern government and eventually became known as the Bureau of Espionage. Its agents now handle intelligence gathering, undercover operations, and the elimination of dangerous Mononoke. That is why the government has an entire division dedicated to Mononoke-related incidents. Until recently, Shiba's job had been fairly quiet because most Mononoke rarely caused any serious problems. But the situation suddenly changed when a group of them attacked one of the Bureau's facilities. During the assault, Rago, who had been sealed inside that building, managed to escape. Even so, Shiba still has no idea how Jiro and Rago ended up fused together, so he asks Jiro to explain everything from the beginning. After hearing the full story, Ichika immediately calls Jiro an idiot for risking his life to save a Mononoke without having any kind of plan. Jiro fires back that he does not need criticism from some stranger he only just met, and Shiba tells Ichika to settle down and focus on the real problem. Jiro and Rago have completely merged, and unless they discover a way to separate them, Jiro may remain like this permanently. They currently have no method of reversing the fusion, and they also have no idea what the other Mononoke involved in the attack might be planning. Because of that, Shiba informs Jiro that the Bureau will be placing him under protective custody. Jiro immediately objects, but Shiba makes it clear that he has no real choice. The Bureau is not some heroic organization devoted to protecting everyone's freedom, and its agents are under no obligation to prioritize Jiro's personal rights over national security. They have already prepared a missing person report to cover his disappearance, and he will be transferred to another facility the following morning. For now, Shiba tells him to rest and mentions that several guards have been stationed outside his room. He claims they are there to protect Jiro in case something happens, but Jiro can easily tell that their real purpose is to make sure he does not flee. Jiro cannot stop worrying about what might happen if the Bureau takes him away. There is a real chance he may never see his grandfather again. Rago points out that this is exactly why he kept warning Jiro that getting involved with him would only bring trouble into his life. Jiro says he is really not in the mood for another lecture, but Rago explains that he is not trying to scold him. He simply wants Jiro to understand how dangerous his current situation truly is. Shiba and Ichika may claim that everything they are doing is meant to protect Jiro, but they are also members of the same organization that imprisoned Rago in the first place. Because of that, Rago finds it difficult to believe they will simply allow Jiro to return to an ordinary life after merging with the Mononoke. And then there are the Mononoke who attacked the facility specifically to free Rago. If they were willing to challenge the entire bureau to reach him, there is no chance they will give up now. Sooner or later, they will come after Jiro as well. At this point, Jiro cannot rely on either side and will have to decide for himself what he wants to do. After thinking everything over, Jiro decides he is done letting other people control his choices. From now on, he is going to do what he believes is right, regardless of what anyone says. His first decision is to escape from the hospital. Rago is surprised since he assumed Jiro had nowhere left to run. But Jiro explains that he is not planning to run away permanently. There are simply a few things he needs to take care of first. Once he has done that, he will accept whatever consequences come afterward. Rago still has no idea what Jiro is planning, but he warns him that there is no guarantee things will work out. He also makes it clear that Jiro cannot expect him to step in and solve every problem. Jiro says he will somehow manage on his own. Just then, he notices several crows gathered outside the window, and an idea immediately comes to him. While the guards remain stationed outside the room, Jiro suddenly begins making as much noise as possible. The moment they rush inside to see what is happening, he calls out to the crows and asks them to attack. The birds instantly swarm the guards, creating enough confusion for Jiro to slip past them and escape. Rago is amazed that the plan actually worked, but Jiro never doubted it for a second. Those crows are his friends, and whenever he asks them for help, they're always willing to come through for him in exchange for a bag of snacks. After putting enough distance between himself and the hospital, Jiro stops to thank the crows for their help. Then he rewards them with a bag of snacks like he promised before sending them on their way. Even though he successfully escaped, Rago reminds him that the bureau is probably already searching the entire area. Jiro says he is not concerned about that yet. There is still one important thing he needs to do before anything else. Not long afterward, Jiro arrives back at his house. At that point, Rago finally understands why he was so determined to get away. Even if the bureau intends to take him somewhere he may never return from, Jiro wants the chance to speak with his grandfather first. The last thing he wants is for the old man to believe that his grandson simply disappeared without a word. Jiro remains outside for a while, struggling to figure out how he could possibly explain everything that has happened. But before he can organize his thoughts, his grandfather suddenly appears behind him and nearly scares him out of his skin. Jiro immediately starts trying to explain himself, but his grandfather cuts him off and tells him to stay quiet and follow. With no idea what the old man is thinking, Jiro decides to obey him for the moment. After walking for a while, Jiro realizes that his grandfather has brought him into a completely deserted stadium. With the bureau likely searching for him already, he becomes impatient and asks how much longer they are going to keep wandering around. He escaped because he needed to speak with the old man before they found him, not spend what little time he has left walking in circles. When Jiro asks why they came to this place at all, his grandfather explains that he wanted somewhere private where nobody would be able to step between them. Before Jiro can ask what he means, the old man drives his fist straight into his face and sends him crashing to the ground. Jiro stares up at him in shock and demands an explanation, only to be called a complete fool for failing to understand the consequences of his actions. Since Jiro still looks confused, his grandfather reveals that Shiba contacted him and explained everything. He already knows that Jiro allowed himself to become fused with a Mononoke. He might have dismissed the story as nonsense if he had only heard it from someone else, but with Rago visibly attached to Jiro, there is no possible way to deny the truth. What shocks Jiro even more is that his grandfather seems perfectly familiar with the Bureau and the existence of Mononoke. That is when he learns the old man was once an operative in the Bureau of Espionage. Although this is the last outcome he ever wanted, his grandfather believes he now has a duty to clean up the disaster his grandson created. His solution is to eliminate Jiro and Rago together before either side can turn them into a weapon. And once he finishes them, he plans to end his own life as punishment for failing Jiro in the first place. Jiro desperately tries to talk some sense into him, but his grandfather has already decided that there is nothing left to discuss. He launches forward without warning and brings down a crushing axe kick. Jiro manages to throw himself aside just before it connects, but the anger on the old man's face is unlike anything he has ever seen. Before Jiro can even steady himself, his grandfather appears directly in front of him and strikes with such speed that Jiro is thrown back onto the ground. Standing over him, the old man explains that the combat techniques passed down through the Azuma family were designed to kill both human enemies and Mononoke. Jiro was only taught a small part of them, because his grandfather wanted him to have enough skill to protect himself, not become involved in this hidden world. He regrets that Jiro will die before discovering how far his abilities could have developed, but in his eyes that is still kinder than leaving him alive to be dragged into the horrors surrounding Mononoke. At the very least, he promises that the final strike will be fast enough that Jiro will feel almost nothing. As his grandfather prepares to finish it, Rago suddenly takes control and catches the incoming blow, forcing the old man several steps backward. Rago shouts at Jiro to stop standing there in a daze and recognize that this is not some misunderstanding. His grandfather is genuinely trying to end his life, but rather than accept Rago's protection, Jiro orders him to disappear and remain inside until he is personally called out again. Whatever happens here, he wants to face his grandfather using his own strength. Rago cannot understand the decision. Jiro has already been overwhelmed and clearly has no realistic chance of winning alone. Even so, Jiro refuses to change his mind. Realizing that arguing will not get through to him, Rago finally backs down and agrees to remain out of the fight. Seeing Jiro refuse to back down brings an old memory rushing back to his grandfather. When Jiro was still a child, he once spotted a kitten track near the top of an enormous tree and immediately climbed after it. Saving the animal was the only thing on his mind, so he never bothered thinking about how he would get back down afterward. His grandfather happened to be there and caught him when he fell, but the rescue was followed by a serious scolding. Wanting to help someone was admirable, yet charging into situations far beyond his ability would eventually cost Jiro his life. The old man warned him that he could not keep carrying every burden alone and needed to trust the people around him whenever a problem became too much to handle. Jiro then asked what he should do if nobody was there to support him. His grandfather bluntly answered that he would have no choice but to walk away. However, Jiro refused to accept a life where he had to abandon someone simply because he was too weak to help. Hearing that, his grandfather gave him one final answer. If giving up was unacceptable, then Jiro would have to become strong enough that no situation could ever force him to do so. Returning his attention to the present, the old man warns Jiro that the hidden world of Mononoke is far more horrifying than anything he can imagine. He had once been dragged into that world himself, where he was forced to kill both humans and Mononoke until he nearly lost sight of who he was. It is a merciless place that slowly destroys anyone caught inside it, which is why he spent years keeping Jiro as far away from it as possible. But after everything that has happened, he feels that all those efforts have ended in failure. Jiro apologizes and admits that this disaster began because he interfered without understanding the consequences. Even so, he cannot regret saving someone who needed his help. Since his decision created this problem, Jiro intends to take responsibility and find a way to fix it himself. Furious at what he sees as pure ignorance, his grandfather calls him a fool and rushes forward. Rago shouts for Jiro to move, yet Jiro refuses to dodge. He receives the punch directly, gets launched backward by the impact, and still manages to plant his feet beneath him instead of falling. Rago is stunned that Jiro willingly took the attack, while his grandfather immediately understands what he was trying to prove. The old man calls the gesture reckless and tells him that enduring a punch does not demonstrate anything beyond his ability to absorb pain. Jiro expected that his determination alone would not be enough to change his mind. However, unlike when he was younger, he is no longer facing everything by himself. Whenever his own strength falls short, he now has Rago beside him. Trying to make the moment sound impressive, Jiro suddenly tells Rago to do that thing. Unfortunately, Rago has absolutely no idea what he means, completely ruining the dramatic moment and making Jiro look ridiculous. The two immediately begin bickering over whose fault it was. Watching them argue reminds the old man of the lesson he gave Jiro years ago about finding someone he could depend on. Their relationship may look chaotic, but he can clearly see the truth underneath it. When real danger arrives, Rago would put his life on the line for Jiro, and Jiro would do exactly the same for him. Realizing his grandson may have finally found the support he always needed, the old man orders them to stop arguing and declares that the fight is over. He gives Jiro permission to choose his own path, although he still makes it perfectly clear that getting himself into this situation was unbelievably foolish. Later that night, everyone returns home and Jiro lowers himself into a hot bath to relax after the chaos of the day. While soaking, he apologizes to Rago for treating him selfishly and pulling him into a personal fight that had nothing to do with him. Rago says he is not particularly bothered by it, but asks Jiro to start depending on him properly instead of taking every attack alone. That way, Jiro might avoid getting beaten half to death the next time something goes wrong. Jiro agrees, though neither of them knows what kind of trouble awaits them from this point forward, since starting tomorrow, Jiro will officially begin working alongside the Bureau of Espionage. By the following day, Jiro has already packed everything he might need. He knows the Bureau could arrive at any moment to take him away, and Rago still cannot understand why he is going along with them so easily. There is no telling what they plan to do once they get him inside their headquarters. Jiro admits that the thought worries him, but stressing over it will not change anything. Running is not a real solution either, because the Bureau would continue hunting him wherever he went. More importantly, he refuses to drag his grandfather back into this mess after everything that happened. So rather than spend his life hiding, Jiro decides to meet the problem directly and deal with whatever is waiting for him. When he steps outside to meet the agent assigned to collect him, Jiro is immediately disappointed to find Ichika waiting there. Out of everyone the Bureau could have sent, they chose the one person he can barely stand being around. Ichika explains that she was specifically ordered to prevent him from pulling another escape like the one at the hospital. She points toward the transport vehicle and tells Jiro that he will remain in the rear compartment with her until they reach headquarters. Jiro hates the idea of spending the entire trip trapped beside her, but he has no power to change the arrangement. After saying goodbye to his grandfather, he climbs into the truck, only for Ichika to lock a pair of handcuffs around his wrists almost immediately. Jiro demands to know whether the restraints are really necessary when he came willingly and has shown no intention of resisting. Ichika bluntly replies that in her eyes, he is still a prisoner. And after merging with Rago, she no longer considers him completely human. She does not understand why the Bureau's leaders are so determined to keep him alive, but her orders are to deliver him safely, and she intends to follow them regardless of how unpleasant it is to guard someone she considers a freak. Being called a freak immediately gets under Jiro's skin, especially since he had been holding back and trying to treat Ichika politely because she was a girl. That comment only makes her angrier. Thinking he is underestimating her, Ichika drives her fist into the wall beside him and warns Jiro to be far more careful with his words. Their argument is interrupted when Rago appears and asks them both to lower their voices because he is trying to sleep. And after looking Ichika over, he adds that the Bureau must be seriously lacking personnel if they are relying on someone so young to escort them. Ichika snaps at him to keep his opinions to himself, saying she has no interest in listening to criticism from a Mononoke. Rago calmly tells her that his comment should be the least of her concerns. She may not have noticed it yet, but something dangerous is already happening around them. Almost on cue, the transport vehicle enters a wall of thick fog. The two agents in the front are confused by how quickly the road disappeared from view and struggle to understand where the mist came from. But before they can react, something goes wrong and the truck suddenly crashes. Jiro and Ichika are violently thrown around inside the rear compartment as the vehicle comes to a stop. Ichika has no idea what caused the accident, but she immediately senses that this is more than a normal crash, so she orders Jiro to remain inside while she heads out to investigate. The moment Ichika steps outside, she realizes the truck has somehow crossed into a spectral zone. What confuses her most is that she failed to notice the transition until now, but she has no time to think about that. Two Mononoke immediately reveal themselves nearby, and the bodies of both drivers have already been devoured. And since the creatures are obviously here for Rago, Ichika activates her equipment and prepares to stop them before they can reach the truck. She opens fire on the larger Mononoke first, only to discover that ordinary bullets cannot penetrate its body. Meanwhile, its smaller companion moves far too quickly for her to keep it in her sights. And with her firearm proving useless against both enemies, Ichika draws her close-range weapon and shifts into melee combat. The smaller creature strikes her hard enough to send her toward the larger one, but she uses her knife to regain control of her movement, slits past the incoming punch, and cuts across the giant's arms several times. Unfortunately, the creature's flesh is so unnaturally dense that her blade leaves only shallow wounds. Ichika immediately understands that none of the weapons she brought can seriously injure it, and the smaller Mononoke is just as troublesome. Because the instant her attention shifts away, it appears behind her and launches her straight into the side of the transport truck. From inside, Jiro sees the metal wall suddenly cave inward and starts wondering what kind of disaster is happening outside. This was supposed to be a simple trip to Bureau headquarters, yet it sounds like the truck is being torn apart. Rago explains that Ichika is most likely fighting Mononoke, and judging by the noise, she is losing badly. When Jiro asks how they were attacked without noticing, Rago tells him that the vehicle must have entered a spectral zone while they were distracted by their argument. Jiro has never heard that term before, so Rago explains that a spectral zone is a separate dimension disconnected from the normal human world, essentially a domain belonging to the Mononoke. Humans occasionally stumble into such places by accident, but escaping after crossing over can be extremely difficult. Jiro barely understands the explanation, but that is not important right now. The sounds outside make it obvious that Ichika will be killed if no one helps her soon, so he asks Rago to break the handcuffs. Rago tells him that it is impossible. The restraints were made from a special substance that suppresses spiritual power, meaning he cannot damage them while Jiro is still wearing them. Growing impatient, Jiro decides to leave the truck and make Ichika unlock the cuffs herself so he can join the fight. Rago advises him to stay where he is and allow the two sides to destroy each other. From his perspective, the Bureau is no different from the Mononoke chasing them. Both groups want control of Jiro and intend to use his fusion with Rago for their own benefit. Letting them continue fighting would give Jiro the perfect opportunity to escape. His argument is reasonable, but Jiro cannot accept it. Whatever Ichika personally thinks of him, she is still outside risking her life to keep the creatures away from the truck. Even if she is only following orders and happens to be incredibly rude, Jiro refuses to sit safely inside while someone dies protecting him, so whether Rago agrees or not, he is going out there to support her. But before Jiro can make a move, the larger Mononoke drives its fist into the transport truck and tears through the side of it, sending Jiro tumbling across the grass. The moment both creatures see him, they identify him as the person they were ordered to capture. And since their mission requires bringing him back alive, they offer him the chance to surrender peacefully and promise not to harm him if he cooperates. Jiro pays absolutely no attention to them. Instead, he shouts at Ichika to remove the handcuffs so he can join the fight. To his disbelief, she refuses, saying she would rather face the creatures alone than accept help from someone fused with a Mononoke. The enemies attack again before either of them can continue arguing, forcing Jiro and Ichika to leap away in opposite directions. Jiro tells her to stop allowing her hatred to control her decisions. If she keeps rejecting his help, neither of them is going to leave this place alive. His words bring back one of Ichika's most painful memories, standing at her mother's funeral after losing her to a Mononoke. From that moment onward, Ichika dedicated herself to becoming strong enough to fight them, believing that was the path her mother would have wanted her to follow. She desperately wants to prove that she can complete this mission alone, but the battle has already shown her otherwise. Jiro reminds her that protecting him is still her responsibility, and if she truly refuses to let the mission fail, then she must use every option available to survive, even if that means fighting beside someone she despises. Every belief Ichika has held since childhood tells her to reject him, yet she can no longer deny that his argument is right. After hesitating briefly, Ichika finally changes her mind and destroys the restraints around Jiro's wrists. The instant his hands are free, Jiro launches himself high into the air and calls on Rago's power. Their combined strike crashes directly into the larger Mononoke and eliminates it with a single blow. Its smaller companion becomes completely distracted by the sudden death of its partner, giving Ichika the opening she needs. She slits behind the creature before it can react and cuts it apart with a rapid series of attacks. Jiro's victory is somewhat less graceful, however, because he put far too much power into his jump and comes crashing back down afterward. Once he recovers, Ichika stands nearby and bluntly tells him not to expect any gratitude from her. Jiro replies that he never helped her for the sake of being thanked. She had risked herself to protect him, so he simply returned the favor, meaning neither of them owes the other anything. Even though she refuses to admit it openly, the encounter clearly improves Ichika's opinion of him. With both Mononoke defeated, they are left facing a much less dangerous but extremely annoying problem. Their transport has been completely destroyed, so Jiro asks how they are supposed to reach headquarters now, and Ichika casually informs him that they will have to complete the rest of the journey on foot. At the same time, Shiba is meeting with the Bureau's senior officials and proposing the creation of a new field unit that would include both Jiro and Rago. The council initially considers the suggestion completely unreasonable, but Shiba argues that Rago has not shown any aggression toward Bureau personnel since merging with Jiro. For the moment, he appears willing to cooperate with the boy, which means controlling the situation may actually be possible. It has also become obvious that an enemy group is actively targeting Rago, so keeping Jiro imprisoned would not make that threat disappear. And instead of locking the two away and leaving them unprepared, Shiba believes they should be allowed to operate in the field, develop their abilities, and gain enough combat experience so they will not be easy targets if the enemy comes after them. Shiba continues by arguing that locking Jiro inside a cell would accomplish absolutely nothing. The enemy already knows about him, which means they will keep searching for him regardless of where the Bureau hides him. If another attack is inevitable, then Jiro would be far better off gaining real combat experience than wasting his time behind bars. Shiba even agrees to accept complete responsibility for every decision Jiro and Rago make from that point onward. His argument proves convincing enough that the senior officials finally approve his proposal and give him permission to handle the situation however he sees fit. The following morning, Jiro stands beside the docks brushing his teeth while reflecting on how completely his life has fallen apart in only a week. Not long ago, he was an ordinary student with ordinary problems except talking with animals. Then he discovered a strange cat, was murdered by a massive ogre, came back fused with a Mononoke, and somehow ended up working for a secret government organization. Shiba soon walks over and asks how he is settling into his new surroundings. Jiro replies that he has barely had the chance to settle into anything, since the Bureau has spent nearly every waking moment running tests on his body. He also still cannot believe that this run-down shipping yard is supposed to be their headquarters. Shiba explains that each Bureau division operates from a separate location designed to blend naturally into the surrounding area. Some divisions use office buildings, while others work out of temples or similar places. Unfortunately, the second division was assigned an old shipping yard, and now that Jiro belongs to the team, he is stuck with it as well. Before Jiro can complain any further, a car enters the base and a young woman steps out. Jiro asks who she is, and Shiba introduces her as Hana Usami, the unit's new assistant chief. Another agent climbs out moments later and immediately begins shamelessly flirting with Hana. His name is Reiji Kirihara. Once everyone gathers inside, Shiba formally introduces the new team and says he hopes they can work together without causing too much trouble. That hope immediately looks unrealistic, since Jiro and Ichika still cannot stand each other. Reiji, however, has no trouble charming her. After only a few minutes of conversation, he overwhelms Ichika with compliments until she begins turning red. But his attitude changes completely when he looks at Jiro, as Reiji makes no effort to hide his disgust towards someone who is now part human and part Mononoke. Jiro refuses to sit quietly while being insulted, so he steps directly into Reiji's face and asks whether he wants to settle the problem with a fight. And Reiji gladly accepts and says he would be more than happy to beat him down. Ichika immediately tries to stop the confrontation before it becomes serious, but Shiba has the exact opposite reaction and seems almost delighted by the idea. He even asks Hana to take out a camera and record the entire thing. Part of him simply wants to enjoy the spectacle, but the fight also serves a practical purpose. They still have no reliable understanding of Jiro's physical limits or how much power he can access through Rago. And without that information, they cannot decide how to use him effectively during actual missions. Once Hana begins recording, Shiba steps back, gives both fighters the signal, and officially starts the match. This was the end of episode 3. Subscribe to not miss the next episode.